What I want to talk about today is the non-relationship between humans and hominids, particularly the Neanderthal. And there are a number of ways to look at this. You've got two questions you're trying to answer, really. One is the question of humans being descended from hominids. Is that believable or is that not believable? The second question is the question of interbreeding between humans and Neanderthals. Is there any reason to believe that humans and Neanderthals have ever interbred? And that question involves the 2 or 3% of Neanderthal genes, or genes which are common between humans and Neanderthals, amongst Europeans and Asians apparently, but not amongst African people. That's a little bit of a thing to try to explain. And there are a number of angles to look at this thing. Let's take a look at the question of descent or evolution first. You've got a problem with what you call population genetics. The great population geneticist, J.B.S. Haldane, in the 1950s had come across a thing which is called the Haldane dilemma, which involves the gigantic spaces of time that it would take to spread any genetic change through any kind of a sizable herd of animals. And Haldane was a committed evolutionist. He didn't want to believe that he had discovered an existential problem for evolution. He assumed that the Haldane dilemma would be resolved. In other words, he threw that out to the people in his own crowd. He said, "I've come across a problem here. One of you guys see if you can fix it." Right? It never did get fixed. There's a book written by a scholar in Minnesota, Walter Riemann, who the book is called Biotic Message, who discusses the Haldane dilemma at length and in fact modernizes it by expressing it without using the concept of genetic death. In other words, Riemann provides a version of the dilemma which is based on nothing but birth rates, and it still turns out to be insurmountable. The simplest version of it goes like this. If you assume that you've got nobody assumes that humans have descended from apes or ape-like ancestors in any more than about 10 million years, right? So you assume that you've got some kind of an ape-like ancestor, quote unquote, walking around 10 million years ago. How far could you get? In other words, trying to spread genetic changes one after another through this herd of animals between then and now, right? I mean, you have to assume that this is going to be, one at a time. You cannot assume that you're spreading genetic changes more than one or two at a time through any kind of a herd of animals. It's like the overwhelming bulk of genetic mutations are harmful or fatal, right? So that if you start spreading large numbers of mutations through any kind of a herd of animals, will go extinct. So you have to assume, the theory says that every once in a rare while you have what they call a beneficial mutation, right? And that this beneficial mutation will spread through the herd of animals, and then starting from that point, some second beneficial mutation will spread through the herd of animals until sooner or later, like 5, 10, 15 million years down the road, presto change, you've got a new kind of animal. Okay, that is the theory. In the case of spreading these kinds of changes through a herd of animals, and the maximum rate at which you can do that, Riemann says, okay, let's just eliminate all the numbers, right? Let's just make an insane assumption, and assume that you could plausibly have a rate of substitution which is vastly greater than you could ever have in real life. Make the thing favor the evolutionists to a ridiculous extent, and basically assume that you've got this proto-human generation time of 20 years, right, and assume that you're going to spread one beneficial mutation through this herd of animals every 20 years, right? Now what that means is that you've got 100,000 animals sitting here. Every generation, all but 2 of them die. Let's put it this way. The 2 get some kind of beneficial mutation, and the other 9,998 just die from jealousy right there. Bang, they're all dead, right? And then the 2 have 100,000 children right there, bang, and replenish the herd so that the whole herd has this beneficial mutation, like presto changeo, bam, like right now. And the question is, well, how many mutations, point mutations, could you spread through this herd of animals in the space of 10 million years? How many times does 20 go into 10 million, right? It's like 500,000. So you figure the furthest you could get is like 500,000 point mutations, which is some fraction of 1% of the genome, right? So in other words, 10 million years, starting from a proto-human or an ape or whatever you want to call it, the furthest you could actually get would be an ape with a slightly shorter tail. Okay, so that says from jump the whole thing is impossible. Okay, but let's assume that we hadn't heard all that and look at a couple of the other things that you need to be looking at as far as like, could we be descended from Neanderthals or from some other kind of human? They have analyzed Neanderthal DNA over the last 10 or 15 years, and what they come up with is that Neanderthal DNA is about halfway between ours and that of a chimpanzee. Now, that says that the gap between humans and Neanderthals is vastly greater than the difference between donkeys and horses. And we know that all mules are sterile, right? In other words, you're not going to get any kind of a viable offspring between even something as far apart as a donkey and a horse. So that, there's no real way to believe that, you had any kind of an evolutionary scheme going between humans and Neanderthals which involved interbreeding or anything like that. Neanderthal DNA is roughly halfway between ours and that of a chimpanzee, so that this thing that Haldane and Walter Riemann are talking about still applies, right? In other words, you might figure instead of talking about some tiny fraction, some fraction of 1% of the genome, you might be talking about 1% or 1.5% or something. It's not going to get you there. There's too many differences between a human and a Neanderthal to believe that we could have ever, descended from Neanderthals. Now, these studies rule the Neanderthal out as a plausible human ancestor. There's no disagreement about that. I mean, anything that you read, there's no disagreement about that. Anything that you read on standard types of biology websites is going to say the same thing right now. Where does that lead the evolutionists? The claim that they're making now is, well, it must be the case that humans and Neanderthals are cousins, right? That we have some sort of a common ancestor, quote unquote, back like 500,000 years ago, not 500 million. And this common ancestor is normally taken to be a type of Homo erectus, which is called heidelbergensis. And just judging from the skulls, we've seen what Danny Vendermini's Neanderthal reconstructions look like. It's not just some slightly different kind of human. I mean, this is something that's seriously scary. You have to assume that heidelbergensis would look as scary to a Neanderthal as the Neanderthal looks to us. The problem is that too genetically remote to be ancestral to is a transitive relationship. In other words, to try to claim that that the gap between humans and Neanderthals is too great, and that we must both be descended from a common ancestor, is like claiming that foxes can't be descended from wolves because the gap is too great. Therefore, foxes must be descended directly from fish, right? In other words, it's idiotic. Like I said, that's part of it. There's another problem with what we've seen looking at Ganymede and Earth in the previous videos, which says that this planet was a very dark, purplish kind of a world 60,000 years ago, and the set of conditions under which Neanderthals thrived would not have allowed humans to thrive without just lots of technology. I mean, early on, in other words, this planet could not have served as a human home planet. You've got a problem that says if you wanted to believe that humans are descended from any kind of hominid, that the hominid is going to have, and this sort of an evolutionary process is going to require the hominid to lose everything he needs in order to live. Right? He's going to have to lose his fur while you have ice ages going on. He's going to have to lose almost all of his night vision in an age in which night was the only time of day that there was. And he's going to have to lose almost all of his sense of smell while trying to make it as a prey animal on land, right? And that's just going to be fatal. I mean, in other words, you could give deer our sense of smell, that they would be extinct within 2 or 3 weeks. It would just be an effortlessly free meal for every predator. I mean, a predator wouldn't have to worry about which way he approached deer. He'd just walk up to them from any which direction, kill them. So that really doesn't work. So you've got that sort of a problem. And just generally the problems with believing that humans are descended from hominids are just too many and they're too big. You've got one final approach to the thing, which would be the approach which Danny Vendramini tries to take in claiming that you've got a more gracile type of hominid living in the Levant 40, 50, 60,000 years ago, which are named after the caves they find them in, School Kafsa in Israel and Lebanon. And at any rate, there's a problem with that. The problem is that there's no evidence of it. James Shreve in the Neanderthal piece mentions that morphology in the School Kafsa area doesn't seem to have said anything about behavior or anything like that. In other words, the School Kafsa hominids simply didn't have any of the artwork, any of the the necklaces, beads, any of the fancy weapons, any of the fancy tools, or any of the things which or any of the things which Cro-Magnon man had from day one. Cro-Magnon man from day one had fabulous artwork. I mean, you've got this thing which they call a Cro-Magnon Sistine Chapel in Lasso, France, right? And there would be some kind of a run-up to that. In other words, you couldn't just have hominids being hominids up until one day when they just said, let's just quit being hominids and start dealing in fine arts and things like that. That's not realistic at all. So that basically all that these School Kafsa hominids really amount to is other hominids who had developed morphology which was slightly more similar to that of humans. That's all they were. The evidence is not compatible with the idea of anything evolving into humans on this planet. What the evidence indicates is that monkeys and apes and hominids have been living here for quite some time, and then humans came here. Right, that's the basic thesis of Cosmos and Collision. Now, you've got a second question, as I mentioned, which says that you've got 2 or 3% of the genome of Europeans and Asians, which match those of Neanderthals, and does that indicate any sort of interbreeding between humans and Neanderthals? There's no fossil evidence of anything like this. Now, again, the Neanderthal piece, James Shreve, mentioned this as a big conundrum. He said that, apparently humans and Neanderthals had been living in proximity for quite some time in the Levant, and there should have been massive evidence of interbreeding, and there just isn't any. So that was just, the two just left each other alone. So that, you've got physical evidence which says, just the lack of evidence provides a very strong indication that you don't have crossbreeding between humans and Neanderthals. In real life, for there to be such a thing as a human Neanderthal crossbreed, something completely ridiculous would have to happen. You'd have to have some Neanderthal male rape a woman, and then, rather than cooking and eating her afterwards, as usual, assuming a woman would even be attracted to a Neanderthal male in the first place, which is problematical. Rather than cooking and eating her, try to keep her alive for long enough to bear a cross-species child, if that's possible, and then raise that child to reproductive age and have him or her breed back into human populations without anybody catching on. Now that's insane. At the time this was happening, you've got humans perpetrating an outright war of genocide against all hominids. I mean, they simply extirpated hominids from the planet root and branch. Not only Neanderthals, but apparently, unless Lloyd Pye is correct, unless you do have like Bigfoot and tiny groups of hominids still walking around in the parts of the earth which are seen only from the air, and I'll believe that the first time I see one of them in a cage somewhere. But unless that's the case, then our ancestor, Cro-Magnon man exterminated all hominids from the planet. And they're not going to tolerate half-breeds amongst their own number while they're doing something like that, right? I mean, it's not like you're going to need DNA testing to find out who to kill for that sort of reason. It's going to be extremely obvious. You know, so the whole thing is basically just not workable. What Troy and I come up with is that there basically just isn't any kind of relationship between humans and hominids at all, other than other than similar design. That's it. Just no way to believe that. There will be some reasonable explanation as to why you might have a certain number of genes in common between humans and Neanderthals. You would have to assume that between rocket telemetry software and banking software, you're going to have a certain number of low-level C language functions in common, right? I mean, that doesn't mean that NASA's software is all hacked from that of J.P. Morgan, right? I mean, that just says that, you know, you're doing a certain number of things the same way, like cars having 4 wheels and a steering wheel, right? You know, trucks have 4 wheels and a steering wheel. It doesn't mean the one's descended from the other. There's some better reason for it. Anyway, that's the question of humans and hominids. There's another question, which I'll get to a bit later, which involves the relationships between your basic human groups. Good enough.